I did it because I hate bureaucracy. My idea of a perfect government is one guy who sits in a small room at a desk, and the only thing he's allowed to decide is who to nuke. The man is chosen based on some kind of IQ test, and maybe also a physical tournament, like a decathlon.
All right, welcome back, guys. You are listening to the Sovereignty Project's second ever episode right here from George Mason University. So today's podcast is brought to you by the term paleoliberalism, a pre-1960s center-left ideology. This was back when Japanese internment camps were still in style. If you missed the first episode we did last month on gun-free zones, it's on our Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel. Search for the Sovereignty Project in either one and it should pop up. And unfortunately, we don't have the show up on any kind of pod hosting sites, but fear not, we should by next month's show at least. We have top people working on it as we speak. And when we say top people, we mean nobody. Now, for our new listeners, Dennis is going to fill you in with who we are and what the show is about.
Yes, we are an outreach podcast. A lot of the media content that's created on the right is for internal consumption. It's by conservatives for conservatives. We're trying to talk about conservative ideas to a broader audience, and we're trying to talk about those most controversial issues that maybe stop people from considering conservatism as kind of a viable ideology.
Thank you, Dennis. So in today's show, we are going to be discussing the minimum wage, and with us is the president of the GMU Economics Society, David Roth. What's going on, David?
Hey, James. I'm doing pretty well.
Awesome.
I guess I should take this chance to tell our listeners a little bit about myself. I'm David Roth, of course. I'm from Ephrata, Pennsylvania, so think Amish country. This is my fourth year here at Mason studying economics, and sixth year actually studying Masonomics, the school of economics dominated by Mason professors. As well as being involved with the Economics Society, I'm also the campus fellow for the Economic and Financial Knowledge Education Organization known as GenFKD.
Cool. Sounds good. And he is so Pennsylvanian. I don't know if that's what they call people from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanians, right?
Yeah, Pennsylvanians.
He's actually in the studio. He's actually wearing a straw hat and overalls. And they are not made by machines. They're made by hand.
Of course.
And he actually came to school with a horse and buggy.
Yes, I did. That is absolutely correct.
So we're going to start off with talking about the minimum wage and what the minimum wage is. And there are essentially, would you say, two different versions of what the minimum wage is, or two different schools of thought about the minimum wage?
Two different schools of thought. So the first one here that I would talk about is that minimum wage is a price control. It's setting the price of labor, the wage, at an artificial level, either above or below the equilibrium level of labor in the economy.
And so what we have basic neoclassical microeconomic theory of the minimum wage. And this is kind of what you learn in your Economics 101 kind of class. And this is your basic free market outlook on the minimum wage. And it's essentially, like David said, where you have the minimum wage is set above market equilibrium on a supply and demand graph. And then when you have the minimum wage set above equilibrium, you have a surplus of supply and you don't have enough demand, a shortage of demand. And what happens from this is, you essentially have unemployment, and we have to understand that wages come from the worker's productivity level. And when the costs of employing that employee exceeds their productivity level, that person is essentially out of a job. And then you kind of have the pro minimum wage argument. And I think one of the bigger economists nowadays for pro minimum wage legislation would be your Paul Krugman types. I don't know where are some other economists out there?
Paul Krugman is the best name that I can think of. A very large percentage of economists in the profession today actually at varying levels support getting rid of the minimum wage. In 2000, with certain criteria, of course. The percentage of economists that wanted to just abolish it was 73%.
Interesting. Did you have anything to say on that, Dennis? Or
Yeah, I'd like to make sort of a devil's advocate argument here. It has to do with how economists and how they talk about these issues, how that's seen by the population in general. Because there are going to be people who sort of start pulling out their hair when we talk about things like the price of labor. When you speak about people as a commodity, there are people who are going to say that's somehow dehumanizing, that this argument sort of views human beings no differently than a mineral resource or something like that. And it's hard to make the argument in the language that we're making it when people have that response.
Dennis is just he's an evil capitalist, and he hates human beings altogether. He's just one of those rich fat cats. He doesn't care about humans at all, and like I said, thinks we're all commodities. No, but in all honesty, I've had these arguments with people too before about whether human labor is a commodity or whether that idea is somewhat dehumanizing. That, well, you're just a price on the market. You're just a point on a graph. But when you come down to the empirical data and scientific analysis, to be honest, you are selling your labor for goods and services. I mean, is that not the definition of what a commodity is? Something that you can sell. I mean, you take yourself and you put knowledge into it, you invest in it, and then you sell it later on in life for goods and services. And I think from the pro minimum wage sort of movement, you have this idea that it's not really based on scientific data, in my opinion. It's more based off of emotional reactions to what human beings are. I think on the left they make more emotional arguments.
There is a debate about whether economics is a hard science, but I think what we're saying here is it attempts to describe the world the way it is. It's not simply a view of life that we can simply adopt or choose not to adopt. We're saying that human beings do, in a sense, act as a commodity, not because we're trying to make them into one.
Well, we talk about humans being commodities, but that shouldn't be a detrimental term. It shouldn't be a dehumanizing term. Object is a commodity. It has a price because it's scarce. Both humans are scarce and our time is scarce. So being labeled as a commodity, we're being labeled as diamonds, essentially. We're all unique and special, going to that whole liberal paradigm.
Absolutely. So I think you guys wanted to jump into the history of the minimum wage, if that's what you guys wanted to do.
Yeah, in the 1920s and 30s, and we're going to be talking throughout the podcast, I should add, about race in the minimum wage, immigrant groups, and the minimum wage. In the 1920s and 30s, the minimum wage began to be talked about as a way to protect the white working class against immigrant groups and against African Americans who it was thought were out-competing the white working class because of the low cost of labor. The first minimum wage law to be passed in the Western Hemisphere was in 1925 in British Columbia, which was designed expressly to favor white Canadian lumberjacks over Asian immigrants. And this was included in official reports to the Canadian government, which stated the board, that is the Adjustment Board of British Columbia, has always taken the view that if employers are obliged to conform to a higher standard of wages, Oriental labor would tend to become less desirable from an employer's point of view, and to a certain extent would be substituted by the employment of white help. So we can see at its very inception, the idea of a minimum wage was designed to favor certain racial and social groups over another, and we're going to get into the economic theory of why that is.
And to go off what he said, I was going to talk about the minimum wage legislation primarily in the Great Depression, because before the Great Depression in the United States, you really didn't have a national minimum wage. You had different states and different cities had their own minimum wages, and they all varied. Now, during the Great Depression, you had the New Deal, of course, which was a whole bunch of basically safety net programs and working programs that would supposedly put people back to work. But part of the New Deal was the National Recovery Administration, and this National Recovery Administration had a series of minimum wages that it was supposed to put in place. Now, the NRA in 1933 was considered unconstitutional and was struck down by the Supreme Court. Now, in 1938, Congress wanted to pass the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was another minimum wage legislation, and this time it got through the Supreme Court, which is kind of a roller coaster of a ride in the first place, and we can talk about that in maybe another episode when we talk about the Constitution. But there was some cronyism and definitely some bribery
Some
involved.
threatening of the Supreme Court also happened at the time. It's a very fun story to
Essentially,
go into.
yeah. It's a good one too. A little bit scary, but it's a fun little story. Anyway, they did pass the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and it established a 25-cent minimum wage. It decreased the length of a work week and added age requirements. And this isn't just including mainland United States. This included all U.S. territories in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. And the reason I stress this was that the day that the minimum wage passed, or the Fair Labor Standards Act went into effect, the State Department, well, let me back up and say the State Department before said that 50,000 people in the United States would lose their jobs as a result of this minimum wage increase. And the State Department was willing to take that hit. And they said the benefit was that 300,000 people would receive pay increases. Well, the State Department didn't exactly, they underestimated the employment losses dramatically, I may add, because the day that the Fair Labor Standards Act went into effect, 40,000 workers in Texas alone, just in the peanut picking industry, lost their jobs overnight. Not all jobs altogether, in one industry and in one state. And it hit the American South altogether pretty hard. And also, I would say, in the state of Puerto Rico alone, 300,000 people lost jobs overnight in Puerto Rico. And it was such a disaster that the governor of Puerto Rico had to send a special telegram to Congress and the president to request that they cut the minimum wage in half for U.S. territories where people there were making well below what people were making in the mainland, even before the minimum wage. So essentially overnight you see entire industries going out of business, and finally U.S. Congress passed a law saying, okay, we'll make exceptions for Puerto Rico because it hit their economy so bad. But by the time they passed this legislation, it had been too late, and a lot of industries in Puerto Rico had been destroyed. And this is why today you see a lot of poverty and you see a lot of crime in underground markets, even in a U.S. territory like Puerto Rico, which has all the benefits, so to speak, of being a U.S. territory. But noncompliance for dealing with the Fair Labor Standards Act was a $10,000 fine and or 6 months of imprisonment in federal prison. Also note that this was done in the midst of a Great Depression, a minimum wage, length of a work week, and age requirements during a Great Depression. I could see this getting passed when you're in maybe a time of economic recovery or a time of economic boom. But if you're trying to recover your economy, you are not going to put in all these labor restraints because you're hindering the recovery even more. Now, I would say with the history of the minimum wage continues on today, they've passed minimum wage increases every 10 years in the United States. The latest in 2009, I believe, to $7.25 an hour in the United States. Or in Obama's last State of the Union address, his big thing was pushing a minimum wage increase. And of course, it still hasn't gone through yet, mainly because politicians know that doing this will hinder the recovery, or they don't want to offend their constituents.
I think it's more along the lines that they don't want to harm their chances of getting reelected in this in the upcoming election cycle.
Exactly. Dennis wanted to talk about the libertarian moral theory of the minimum wage, and more specifically, freedom of contract for people.
Right. Libertarians view the individual as an actor with agency. We don't believe that I should be prohibited from entering into an arrangement with another person or an entity, a conglomeration of other people, simply because a third party, that is the state or those who are advocating minimum wage policy, just because that third party believes that these arrangements are somehow unfair to me. If I believe that the wage I'm being offered is a fair price for the labor that I'm putting on the market, I should have the right to enter into whatever arrangements I want. And that's really not an area where a third party has the right morally to be involved, because they're restricting not just the company's freedom of action, but also mine.
Right, and at that point, you can get into the natural rights debate about that, saying that freedom of contract is a natural right that should be protected. And I was going to say that freedom of contract was one of the reasons that the original NRA, not National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Administration, which was part of the New Deal, this was one of the reasons why the NRA was shut down, was because the Supreme Court said that a minimum wage was unconstitutional under the guise that you are not respecting freedom of contract of the individual. And then when they were threatened, when the court was threatened in 1938, they reversed their decision.
Very strangely.
Right.
Can't imagine why they would do that.
But yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add to that, David.
I would just say constitutionally, like, the method through which Congress can justify the minimum wage is very convoluted. They would have to resort to the Commerce Clause of the Constitution and probably the Necessary and Proper Clause as well, which is, it goes into the realm of implied powers, not explicit powers found within the Constitution.
Right, exactly. And of course, that's a topic for another episode as well, going into what powers Congress has as far as dealing with the economy, and how the Constitution is a little bit vague about that stuff. But I think for the most part, you can make a constitutional argument that freedom of contract is part of, let's say, the First Amendment, your freedom of speech. I don't know if that's...
If we want to define contract as a freedom of association, then certainly.
Right.
Within all of our founding documents, there also was a very high regard for property. So you would, of course, we can of course say that we own ourselves, and it could be argued that we own the product of our labor as well.
Oh, that's a great point. Absolutely. I think we're going to move on to workplace conditions.
Actually, I believe David wanted to give us some of the arguments in favor of the minimum wage from an economic point of view, and I was going to give another view in which some of these can be made maybe into cons.
Yeah, that's right. And a couple of my points actually were the whole workplace effects that minimum wage will have. So the first one right off the bat here is the work ethic of every employer, or every employee rather. So an employer is going to hire less people, or they're going to lay off people. So naturally, they will expect more out of the workers that they retain. They will expect a higher ethic of labor and a higher level of production, really, a higher productivity. So that builds into a worker a certain work ethic that they can apply to be a better employee in the industry they're currently in, and take that to be a better worker in every other job that they have for the rest of their life. Another point that I would make is that minimum wage almost unintentionally causes an increase in automation and replacement of workers with machines in the workforce. Some people might argue this point is negative, but really it's what Bastiat would say, a broken window fallacy. Like, we're replacing labor in low-skilled job environments with technology, freeing up those workers to do something more productive with their time or something completely different altogether. One last point that I would argue is the income effect. So when we increase minimum wage, the people that benefit from that are poor. And what we know about impoverished people, both like in the United States and in the developing world, is when they get an increase in their wage, they're not necessarily going to save it. It's more likely that they're going to use it on leisure goods, on commodities. Like, they're going to get a television or go out and eat a fancier restaurant that they normally could. They are going to do things to ease the suffering, really, of their everyday life. And of course, that will stimulate the economy of the service sector, at least. And those are the main points that I had on that.
Right. I'd like to respond to the first 2 points about workplace condition, which, with arguments which might be described as left libertarian. With the work ethic, I think another way to describe that is that the minimum wage incentivizes sort of a tyrannical managerial approach within the workplace. And there's a way of viewing freedom which is beyond the economic way that we as conservatives traditionally view it, which is, of course, a very valid and important way to look at it. But as believers in liberty, I think we should also we should want to at least minimize situations in which human beings are forced to conform to the arbitrary will of another person, even if they've consented to be in these arrangements generally. And we should certainly not want the state to intervene in a way that makes those kind of arrangements more rigid. So if I'm one employee in a workplace that would otherwise have 5 because of the minimum wage, my employer is going to be more likely to scrutinize how I'm spending every second of my time. And because of that, I spend more of my life having to adhere to the arbitrary will of another person. And going into the mechanization part, that also, in a way, I'm saying that the traditional left-wing view of what's called Taylorism, the scientific theory of management, can be seen not really as a critique of free market capitalism, but as a critique of state capitalism. As far as mechanization goes beyond that, I would think there's also kind of a consumer preference for dealing with human beings as opposed to machines in certain situations. But that demand on the part of the consumers may not necessarily be met if the minimum wage creates more of a incentive for mechanization.
I think it would. Niche markets would develop if this demand actually exists, if this demand for human interaction exists as opposed to machine interaction. That's just my opinion on it.
So, yeah, I would say that those are all really good points. And to kind of get back to, I guess, mechanization, next time you go into a grocery store, go look at the checkout lines. There's going to be about 8 checkout lines, and there will be maybe 2 people actually running those checkout lines. And the majority of the checkout lines that are open are going to be self-serving checkout lines, because it's more beneficial to have these open checkout lines where you can just do it yourself rather than pay someone $7-8 an hour to do this. It's a benefit cost ratio.
Right. All that I'm saying is that we should not want to put in place anything more than the incentive already created by the free market towards that sort of mechanization.
I would say I agree. I would say technology has always been a friend of the worker, even though you would see people like Karl Marx and many 19th century unions would violently destroy machines inside of factories because they saw them as a threat to their employment, when in reality, by destroying these machines, you're actually destroying worker productivity, and therefore they are inherently decreasing their incomes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would think of anecdote of the steel industry prior to the blast furnace and the mechanization really made by Andrew Carnegie and making it affordable to make all of our buildings out of steel. The production of steel was a gilded industry. It would be a master and an apprentice, and of course, these two people would have insanely high wages because, like, they're only the 1% of the population that could actually do it. With the advent of the blast furnace and the coke furnace, a lot of people were raised out of poverty. It was more simple to produce steel, and it indeed took more people. So the machinery and the technology that was invented passed along the higher wages to the workers.
Oh, absolutely. I would also say that a lot of economists nowadays point out that if a lot of these labor regulations went into place, such as minimum wage, of course, prior to the Industrial Revolution or at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 1870s, that it may have stunted industrial growth by quite a bit. So, for example, you didn't see a lot of these market regulations coming into place until the 1920s or the early 1910s. So, cleaner factories, child labor laws, things like that, work hour regulations. But you have to understand that every country, no matter how immoral it seems, every country that goes through industrialization has to go through this period where there are going to be bad conditions. And while it may seem that they are terrible, which of course they are, you have to remember that prior to industrialization, conditions were even worse. Take, for example, in the 1800s or the very early 1800s, you could argue that the difference between a poor man and a middle-class man was the fact that he had shoes. While in the late 1800s, you could say that industrialization created or moved it to the point where the difference between a poor man and a middle-class man was not the fact that he had shoes, but whether he had a house and bread on the table. And then as industrialization increased, productivity and output increases, therefore your wages increase. And if they had done that at the early stages of industrialization, you would have seen productivity stunted.
I think the role of immigration in that process needs to be made clear, because conditions in the United States may not have been all that much worse, but the conditions in the countries which these workers were coming from generally were. I mean, you're allowing sort of Russian serfs or the lowest classes of society from all across the world to come here, work in conditions we'd consider horrible today, but then allow their children a life in a country which was much better than that of their birth in terms of those kinds of conditions.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely true. And I would also point out that, if you're coming from, let's say, like you were saying, Russia, if you're coming from Italy or Germany, the conditions in those factories were probably and most likely worse than they were in the United States, of course. So while the United States, and you will probably learn this in high school or where education is just so great, especially when it comes to history, the typical story that you'll see of the period of industrialization is a time of mistreatment, capitalism, profits, and how the employer exploited the employee. Yes, like we were saying, conditions weren't up to our modern conditions, but if it weren't for industrialization, we wouldn't even have the conditions that we have today. They would be much, much worse, because like you said, when productivity increases, so does the workers' pay increase.
And even more than that, as marginal productivity increases, workers, well, they're going to have a better earning potential, and they're more willing to give up part of their wage in the form of compensating differentials. What I mean by that is better working conditions or shorter hours. This is something that's been tested recently by Ben Powell in the developing world. He would go to factories in Central and South America, what we would call sweatshops, and he would take a survey of the people who worked there, and he would ask them if they wanted like better working conditions, like fans in the workplace, for instance, because it gets pretty hot down there, hence sweatshops. And he'd give like a long list of various compensating differentials, various improvements to the workplace, and then he'd also make sure they understood if you get these better working conditions, you would also have a lower wage. You'd be sacrificing your wage. And across the board, people said they would prefer to have their wage as opposed to the differential.
Absolutely. And so, David, why would you think that by the 1920s we see social programs and safety nets pop up in the United States? And at that point is usually when people see that conditions are improving dramatically. And so you have minimum wages starting to come up, better work hours, cleaner conditions. You see less children working. Maybe, obviously not to the extent that we have nowadays, but you see a lot of these good things coming out of the period of industrialization at the same time that these social programs are coming up. Would you say they have any correlation whatsoever to each other, or?
I would say that there's a possible correlation between like the natural market process of diminishing child labor and getting better working conditions, and of course the push to make these conditions into national law. There's probably a correlation there. I'd have to look at the data more closely, but really, by that point, all the programs that the progressives were pushing became irrelevant because they were just naturally emerging in the marketplace. And what the bills became were just the last nail in the coffin of poor industrialization working conditions.
Right, and I would also add that at that point, when these social programs were being instituted, that the country could already afford these things because of industrialization. Now, if these social programs would have been put in place, like I said, prior to industrialization, you would have seen a huge stunt in growth. I mean, I don't know of any other place in the world that you see this right now. I mean, most countries that are going through rapid industrialization, such as Africa, India, and China, you don't see many of these social programs at all. Whereas countries that have already gone through industrialization are the ones who have all the safety nets, are the ones who already have social programs, because they don't need to go through this period of industrialization. I'm sure if they were in pre-industrial conditions, they wouldn't have as many social programs.
Right. I'd just like to agree to that by saying I think the progressives wind up getting a lot of credit for things we would say would have happened anyway as the result of the workers gaining additional bargaining power. That argument can be difficult to make because it requires us to engage in historical sort of counterfactuals, but I do think it allows us to state our position about the minimum wage as it exists now, that getting rid of it, the workers would still have a bargaining power that would allow them to ensure decent working conditions, things like that. But, yeah. Or a decent wage. Sorry, we're kind of crossing topics there. Yeah.
It always seems like we do that anyway. We always bring up an extra topic.
Yes.
And then we're like, oh well, we'll just talk about that some other time. There are so many variables that are interconnected, and it's hard to not go into them while we're talking about a specific topic like today. I would, at some point, we do want to talk about the Gilded Age and sort of the progressive era, because a lot of that does tie in with the minimum wage that we see today. Did you guys want to go into minimum wage and unions?
Since you brought it up, we might as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know today unions play a big role in the minimum wage, and I would have to say that look, most union members make well above the minimum wage. You don't see many union workers making $7.25 an hour. Why do unions support the minimum wage? Is it because they care about the worker? You have to understand that unions are trade blocs. They're a group of workers who have a certain interest in protecting their jobs. And in order to protect those jobs, you're not competing just against the employer. You're mostly competing against other employees. And when I'm talking about other employees, specifically talking about unskilled labor. Because unskilled labor is your biggest competition. They pose the biggest threat because they will work for a wage that is less than yours. So by pushing and lobbying for legislation that will push unskilled laborers out of the labor market, you now have an increased price for unskilled labor, and because of this, you can now push for your own wages to be increased on top of these new minimum wage laws. So you have to understand that laborers compete against each other, not just against employers. And this is also that comes out of this progressive area, that it's the employer versus the employee, which in most cases is really not true. Like I said, unions are trade blocs just like any other kind of safety net.
Labor unions sort of function as monopolies from the perspective of supply of labor. The collusion of workers within a certain industry to get higher labor, not only for the regular union member that's working on the factory floor, but it also helps. It sets up a barrier to entry for other laborers to enter the market. Like they either pay the union dues or they just can't participate in that industry.
Right. And in a lot of states, you have right-to-work states as well, right, which is unions will push for these laws that will say, hey, if you want to work for this company, you have to join a union. And joining a union isn't always easy, so it puts these other people that want to work union-free, it essentially puts them out of work.
Right. There is kind of a discourse that happens in libertarian circles about the right-to-work laws, in the sense that, according to libertarian theory, businesses should have the right to require you to join a union if that's what they want, but they also should have the right to completely distance themselves from unions and disallow union membership among their employees. So right to work becomes sort of a lesser of two evils. We're at a point where the state either allows something or it mandates it, which that's kind of the danger of statism. All that is legal is mandatory.
And the thing about unions being involved with the minimum wage legislation is that unions usually get involved under the guise of morality. And it's going back to this whole morality issue that, these are people you're dealing with. They need to get paid a fair wage. So we're here to protect the worker. When in reality, you can make the point that it's probably immoral because you're pushing other workers out of the marketplace. And you're kind of cheating them out of a job.
Before I move on, I'd like to touch on the topic again of how the minimum wage affects immigrant groups. Essentially, any group that comes into this country generally doesn't do so with a lot of capital, either social or material. As a result of that, they start at the bottom of the economic ladder. What the minimum wage does is to cut off the bottom rung of the ladder. It prevents any family or any group of people from advancing economically. Another effect of that is that it funnels people working in conjunction with another left-wing policy into an intergenerational culture of welfare dependency. If you come to this country and you can't find a job because the state does not allow a company to pay you a small enough wage for the skills you have, you may wind up getting on welfare, and you're not going to transfer enough to your descendants to allow them to join the workplace, and that can lead to the kind of intergenerational poverty and dependency that we see in this country right now, sadly, in certain areas.
And yes, another argument that I was going to make too is that usually you see a lot of people will say that employers can afford to pay, let's say, an extra 5% increase in the minimum wage, or even an extra $5. Why can't you pay $15 an hour? That doesn't seem like a big raise. Well, to be honest, marginal productivity, the marginal profit for a lot of companies is relatively low. You aren't seeing a lot of companies out there making giant, huge profits. And the profits, after a certain point of growth, you usually see profits either being closer to zero, where it kind of goes flat. And that's where growth kind of stunts. Now, by adding a minimum wage to this, it's very difficult for small business owners to be able to afford, let's say, an extra hand. If you own a repair company and you repair refrigerators and you have two people working for you, let's say you want to add another bus or another van to your company so you can double the amount of hours and the amount of work that's going on. That extra $5 added on to hire two more people plus the cost of another vehicle that's doing more work, you may not be able to afford that because a lot of small business owners, like I said, run very tight budgets. And we can also talk about large companies. I mean, you're looking at places like Walmart. Why can't places or companies like Walmart afford to pay a cashier $15 an hour? Well, it goes back to market prices. Your wages are determined by your productivity level. Why pay someone more than what their productivity level dictates?
James, did we also want to talk about the minimum wage and inflation and monetary policy?
Right. I was going to talk about, or maybe this is probably in David's realm more.
I'm not a monetary guy, but one thing that I do know about the minimum wage is that it can cause inflation in the market. So what will happen is the companies they have to pay their laborers more, and they have to make up that cost somewhere, right? So they can either take a hit to profits, or they can raise the price of their goods that they provide to the rest of the community, and that just causes a general increase in the price of goods and services in the market, inflation.
If a country wants to decrease the minimum wage, all they have to do is inflate the economy, turn on the printing press. And this will decrease real wages, while in the legislative area, you can increase the normative wage rate. So it seems like the employee is getting more, but if you have a faster printing press than you do an increasing minimum wage, then someone's wages are going up normatively, and then the real wages are actually decreasing because the value of the dollar is actually decreasing. So you can trick people for a small period of time into thinking they have higher wages when in reality they have lower wages, and plenty of countries have done this before. I think the famous saying is that you can trick some people some of the time, but you can't trick all of the people all of the time. So once people figure this out, that the value of the dollar is decreasing due to inflation, they will demand higher wages. So Congress will grant them higher wages. Well, the Federal Reserve will just make the printing press go even faster. So it's a repetitive cycle that does nobody any good. In the long run, though, in monetary policy, the wages always balance out. The real wages do.
I guess as we finish up then, I'll make one last point, which may seem a little trivial, but I think it touches on the way we view the landscape of our daily lives. Perhaps is not necessarily political. We don't think that the fact that we have to pour our own pump our own gas or make our own minor household repairs, we don't think of these things as political. In fact, these are things that can be traced to minimum wage laws, because most people, we can't pay, or we're not willing to pay for these services when the state does not allow us to pay a wage that's low enough for those sort of things. As a result, we have this sort of do-it-yourself culture, which some people have embraced, but which others of us regard as aggravating. And in that way, this is a policy that is really touched on our day-to-day existence. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I would just say if I could hire someone to do my laundry and clean up the house after I'm done messing it up, that would be fantastic.
And I would say before we end, I was going to make 2 more points. I was going to talk about rural versus more urban or city environments when it comes to wages. In the cities, you tend to see higher wages just naturally under market conditions, normal market conditions. So when the federal government puts in, let's say, a $10 or a $15 minimum wage, well, in a lot of cities, you already have $15 minimum wages or market wages as a result of market conditions. So it doesn't really hurt a whole lot of people in that situation. Now, when you take that $15 minimum wage and you put it in places like rural Alabama or the American South or someplace out west where there's very few people and the market conditions or the market wages out there are, let's say, $5 to $7, you are doing them a lot of harm. And that's why you're going to see increased unemployment in areas like the farm areas of the country or southern states. I would say Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, where you have a lot of unskilled labor and a lot of farming jobs, which is where you see a big concentration of the loss in jobs for unskilled labor. And I would also make the point that a lot of unskilled labor is within the demographic of high schoolers, teenagers, and young adults. The statistics show that roughly 50% of all minimum wage earners are teens and very young adults who live in households that already make $40,000 annually. And I would also stress the point that because of minimum wages, it hurts teenagers the most, especially minorities that you see in places like the rural South, where you have a lot of immigrants working on farms. And this is really their first job at that age. I mean, when you turn 16, 17, or 18, you're going to start looking for a job, and you have almost no experience. So if you think about it, a very unskilled job that requires almost no skills at all, suddenly you take a minimum wage, add, let's say, $10, $15, when the job requires a productivity level of, let's say, $7, you are dramatically decreasing the pool of people that can work in that. So you are depriving a lot of people of their first job experience. And this is one of the biggest arguments against the minimum wage, is that you're cheating a lot of kids out of their first areas of where they can gain practical work ethic and experience within the marketplace.
You're making a year requirement, a year work experience requirement to flip burgers at Burger King, for instance.
Right. But even if you're going to go to college, there are certain things that you do learn from a low-skilled job. I mean, you learn basic work ethic. You learn how to work hard. And without those, you may suffer when you go into a professional style job, if that's what you do.
You learn conscientiousness too. You
Absolutely.
learn to show up to work on time, which is incredibly important if you want to be successful in life.
Absolutely. So you're essentially, like Dennis said earlier, you're chopping the lowest totem pole or the lowest bracket off of the totem pole when it comes to employees. Off the economic ladder, so to speak, and they don't get a chance to gain employment. Now, if every child in America was born with a Harvard education, a minimum wage of $15 probably wouldn't be a big deal.
At that point, thinking of it in terms of market equilibrium, the equilibrium would probably be well above $15 an hour, so it wouldn't make a difference whatsoever.
Exactly.
And just to think about it in a different way, instead of a totem pole, think of the market as an ecosystem. What we're doing here is essentially killing off plankton, for instance. So the bigger fish won't have anything to eat, and the sharks won't be able to eat the bigger fish because the bigger fish died off, and then the entire ecosystem crumbles to dust.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've actually never thought about it in that kind of way. And I would also point out that when you have this bottom chain cut off, and these people can no longer get jobs, and a lot of these, and like I said, it hurts immigrants and minorities much more than it hurts your Native Americans. Not Native Americans as in like Native Indians. I'm talking about like native-born American citizens. But it hurts minorities and other lower class people much more than it hurts anybody else, even though the people who pass these kind of legislation, minimum wage laws, say that it helps minorities and poor people, when in reality it does the exact opposite. It doesn't give them a chance to get jobs for the most part. I mean, if you have, let's say, a high school dropout who's a minority, they have literally no skills, and suddenly you put them in a wage of $15 an hour or $10 an hour. What are their chances of getting, even if they do get a job at McDonald's? It's a job. It's a place where you can learn work ethic, where you can learn to work hard. You can gain a little bit of money while you're doing it, while you do it to support your family. And even though it may not seem like the best job to start off with, it's a job. And by doing this to someone who's a high school dropout, who has no education to get any other kind of job, this is a big deal for them. I mean, this is a big deal for someone in that kind of situation. And it's very unfortunate that there are people like that that are in that situation, but there's that's the world. So by putting in minimum wages, you are essentially cutting this kid's opportunity to move up in life. And I think it's kind of perverse that happens. You take someone like that who is maybe a minority and has never had a job before and is a high school dropout. Well, what does this person do for employment since they can no longer get employment at places? Let's just use a fast food restaurant for an example, or any kind of unskilled labor market.
Just say McDonald's, for instance.
McDonald's, right. Where are they going to go from there? Many people are going to move into the black market. They are going to go into under-the-table dealings. They are going to mess with tax evasion. They are going to get involved with drugs, prostitution, and more than likely they're going to be involved with organized crime. So you could say that minimum wage is one of the variables involved with forcing young children or young kids, young adults. I don't know why I said young children. But yeah, it's one of the reasons that young adults are forced into crime.
Right. We talked about this last month in our gun podcast. Gang crime can be seen as sort of the combined outcome of a number of statist policies, gun laws, drug laws, and in this case also the minimum wage law. It's when you make anything illegal, there's still going to be a demand for that, and there will grow up a culture of organizations dedicated to meeting that demand, and violence will have to be employed in doing that because they're outside the protection of the courts.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to wrap the show up now. We want to thank David for joining us today, and also the GMU studio, or WGMU studios, for letting us use their equipment. For next month, we plan on discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you are interested in being involved with the Econ Society here at George Mason, they meet every Wednesday at 7:30 in Enterprise Hall 318. Also, please leave us feedback on our page. It's really important so we can improve the show for you guys. But thanks for watching. See you guys next time.